On the evening of October 12, 1984, the Peterson family, James and Carol Peterson, their three children, Rebecca, 16, Michael, 13, and little Amy, 6, and James's father, Walter Peterson, 71, were driving north on Kentucky Route 11 through the remote mountains of Leslie County in southeastern Kentucky, returning home to Hazard after visiting relatives in Virginia for the weekend. They were traveling in their 1979 Ford F-250 pickup truck, a brown and tan two-tone vehicle with an extended cab that could fit the whole family, moving cautiously along the narrow, winding roads where the autumn fog was settling into the valleys as the sun dropped behind the ridgelines. It was approximately 6:30 p.m. when James Peterson's truck came upon a slower-moving vehicle, a rusted 1976 Dodge Ram pickup driven by 44-year-old Vernon Blackburn, who was weaving slightly across the center line, clearly impaired by the whiskey he and his younger brother, Curtis Blackburn, age 37, had been drinking steadily since they'd finished deer hunting around 3 p.m. that afternoon. The Blackburn brothers were heavily intoxicated. Vernon had consumed at least a pint of Old Crow bourbon. Curtis had drunk nearly as much, and both men were in the mean, aggressive state that characterized their drunkenness, the kind of intoxication that made them looking for reasons to fight rather than reasons to laugh. James Peterson, frustrated by the slow pace and by the dangerous weaving of the truck ahead, honked his horn twice. Brief, polite honks meant to alert the driver that someone was behind him and would like to pass when safe. What James Peterson didn't know, what he had no way of knowing in 1984 before widespread awareness of road rage, before cell phones that could call for help, before any modern safety infrastructure, was that Vernon and Curtis Blackburn were exactly the wrong people to honk at. Were men with violent criminal histories spanning decades, were drunk and armed with loaded shotguns from their hunting trip, and were the kind of men who'd interpret a polite horn honk as mortal insult requiring immediate and violent response. Vernon Blackburn slammed on his brakes, forced the Peterson truck to stop, and within moments had initiated a confrontation that would become one of the most horrifying crimes in Kentucky history. A drunken rampage where two brothers would chase a family across 30 miles of mountain roads, would eventually force them off the road and down an embankment, and would then systematically murder all 6 people with an old 12-gauge shotgun because a father had dared to honk his horn at the wrong men on the wrong evening in the isolated mountains, where help was miles away and where screaming wouldn't be heard by anyone who could intervene. Disclaimer: this is a fictional narrative created for educational and storytelling purposes. The Blackburn brothers, the Peterson family, and all events described are entirely fictional. No such crime occurred in Kentucky, in 1984, or at any other time. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. This story contains graphic depictions of violence, including violence against children, and may be disturbing to some readers. If you have the courage to hear this fictional story, click here to find out what happened, but I warn you, the details reveal the brutal reality of violence in isolated rural America during an era when safety infrastructure was minimal and when drunk driving was far more common and far more deadly than in the modern era. This narrative explores how two drunk middle-aged brothers with histories of violence transformed a routine traffic interaction into a massacre, how the isolation of 1984 Kentucky mountains created circumstances where a family could be hunted and killed without anyone witnessing or intervening, and how the combination of alcohol, firearms, and violent temperaments created a perfect storm of horror on roads that should have been safe, but became a hunting ground, where ordinary people discovered that sharing mountain roads with dangerous drunk men could result in their deaths. Hook, the initial confrontation. The first indication of trouble came at 6:32 p.m. when Vernon Blackburn's Dodge Ram suddenly braked hard in the middle of Route 11, forcing James Peterson to slam on his brakes to avoid a collision. "What in the world?" James muttered, gripping the steering wheel as his F-250 shuddered to a stop approximately 15 feet behind the Blackburn vehicle. "Daddy, why did we stop?" 6-year-old Amy asked from her position, squeezed between her mother Carol and grandfather Walter in the front bench seat. The extended cab behind them held Rebecca and Michael, both of whom had been reading by the fading daylight. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe there's something in the road." But there was nothing in the road, just the Blackburn truck sitting motionless, exhaust pipe smoking, brake lights glowing red in the gathering dusk of an October evening in 1984. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The Blackburn truck just sat there, engine running, blocking the narrow 2-lane road. Then the driver's door opened and Vernon Blackburn stepped out. Vernon Blackburn was 44 years old in October 1984, looked older than his years, stood approximately 6'1", but was heavy-set at around 240 pounds, much of it fat from years of heavy drinking and minimal physical activity beyond the occasional hunting trip. He wore stained canvas work pants, a red and black flannel shirt that had seen better days, and muddy work boots. His face was red and bloated from alcohol. His movements were unsteady as he walked back toward the Peterson truck, and even from 15 feet away James could tell the man was drunk, could see it in his weaving gait, could recognize the aggressive body language that drunk men often displayed when they were looking for confrontation. "Stay in the truck," James told his family quietly, then rolled down his window as Vernon approached. Vernon leaned down close to the window, close enough that James could smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to be intimidating rather than conversational. "You got a problem?" Vernon asked, his words slightly slurred, but his hostility clear. "No, sir, no problem," James said carefully, recognizing immediately that this was a dangerous situation. "The road was narrow. I just honked to let you know I was behind you, that's all." "You honked at me," Vernon said, and it wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "Like I'm driving wrong, like I'm some asshole you can just honk at." "I didn't mean any disrespect," James said, keeping his voice calm and respectful, even though he was beginning to feel genuine fear. The man was drunk, was clearly looking for a fight, and James had his entire family in the truck, including his elderly father and his youngest daughter. "I was just trying to let you know I was here, that's all." "Bullshit," Vernon said, his voice getting louder. "You think you're better than me. Think you can honk at me like I don't matter." Before James could respond, the passenger door of the Blackburn truck opened and Curtis Blackburn got out. Curtis was younger than Vernon at 37, was thinner at maybe 180 pounds, stood about 5'10", wore similar stained work clothes, and was equally drunk. Maybe more drunk than Vernon, based on the way he had to steady himself against the truck when he first stood up. Curtis walked back to where Vernon stood, and James could see that Curtis was carrying something, an old shotgun, a double-barrel 12-gauge that looked like it had been manufactured decades ago, with a wooden stock that was cracked and worn, with metal that was pitted with rust in places. The gun was open, broken at the breech, but Curtis was carrying it in a way that communicated threat rather than the casual transport. "Everything okay, Vernon?" Curtis asked, though he was looking at James when he said it. "This asshole honked at me," Vernon said. "Thinks I'm driving too slow for him." "That right?" Curtis said, and he closed the shotgun with a snap that was loud enough to be heard inside the Peterson truck, that made Carol gasp and made Walter reach over to put his hand on James's shoulder in warning. "Listen," James said, his fear now escalating into genuine terror, as he realized these drunk men had a loaded gun and were becoming increasingly aggressive. "I apologize if I offended you. I was just trying to be polite, just trying to let you know I was behind you. We're just trying to get home. We have children in the truck." "Don't care if you got the president in your truck," Vernon interrupted. "You disrespected me. You honked at me like I'm some kind of drunk asshole who can't drive." The irony of Vernon saying this, while clearly being a drunk man who shouldn't be driving, wasn't lost on James, but pointing that out would obviously make things worse. James glanced in his rearview mirror, calculating whether he could put the truck in reverse and back away, but the road behind him curved sharply and backing up at any speed would be dangerous, especially with his family in the truck. "I'm sorry," James said again. "What can I do to make this right? Can we just both get back in our trucks and continue driving? Can we forget this happened?" Vernon stared at James for a long moment, his bloodshot eyes trying to focus, his drunk brain processing the apology and the request. For a second, James thought maybe Vernon would accept the apology, would get back in his truck and drive away, would let this end without violence. But then Curtis spoke up. "He's scared, Vernon. Look at him shaking. He knows he fucked up." Vernon's expression changed. The momentary consideration of letting things go was replaced by a cruel smile. "Yeah, I can see that. He's scared. Good. He should be scared." "Please," James said, abandoning pride entirely now, thinking only about protecting his family. "We don't want any trouble. We'll apologize. We'll wait here until you're out of sight. We'll take a different route home. Just please let us go." Vernon looked past James into the truck, at Carol holding little Amy, at Walter's weathered face, at Rebecca and Michael, visible in the extended cab behind. "Nice family you got there," Vernon said, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a compliment. "Vernon, let's make 'em follow us," Curtis said, and there was something excited in his voice, something that suggested an idea he found amusing. "Make 'em understand they can't just honk at people." "Yeah," Vernon said slowly, the idea clearly appealing to his drunk brain. "Yeah, that's good. Follow us, city boy. We're going to take you somewhere and teach you some manners." "I'm not following you anywhere," James said, trying to sound firm, but hearing the fear in his own voice. "If you're going to do something, you'll have to do it here on the road where someone might see." Curtis raised the shotgun, pointed it directly at James through the open window. "You'll follow us, or I'll shoot you right now and then shoot your whole family. Your choice." In 1984, before cell phones, before GPS tracking, before any of the safety infrastructure that would later exist, James Peterson faced an impossible decision. Follow two drunk armed men into the mountains where anything might happen, or refuse and possibly be shot here on the road while his family watched. Either choice could result in his family being hurt or killed, and he had only seconds to decide. Carol was crying quietly, trying not to frighten Amy, who was already starting to whimper. Walter squeezed James's shoulder, trying to communicate something: strength, support, or maybe just shared terror at the situation they were in. "Okay," James said finally. "Okay, we'll follow you. Just please don't hurt anyone. We'll do whatever you say." Vernon smiled, a drunk, cruel smile. "Smart man. Curtis, get in the truck. We're taking these folks for a ride." Stakes. The isolation of 1984. Rural Kentucky. The stakes facing the Peterson family were shaped fundamentally by the era and the location. 1984 rural Kentucky was a place and time where modern safety infrastructure didn't exist, where help could be miles away, and where dangerous drunk drivers with guns were a far more common threat than they would be in later decades. The technology gap. In 1984, the safety technologies that would later seem essential simply didn't exist. No cell phones meant that once you were on isolated mountain roads, you couldn't call for help, couldn't contact police, couldn't alert family that you were in danger. The Peterson family had no way to call 911, even though they were being kidnapped by armed drunk men. No GPS tracking meant that if someone disappeared on mountain roads, finding them required physically searching miles of terrain, checking every side road and hollow, with no electronic signals to guide searchers to the right location. No dash cameras or other recording devices meant there was no electronic record of what was happening, no video that would later show the confrontation or identify the attackers. No immediate communication between vehicles meant James Peterson couldn't flash his lights or honk his horn in a pattern that would alert other drivers that he was in distress. And even if he could, there was no guarantee anyone would understand or respond to such signals. The Peterson family was trapped in a situation where the only tools they had were their own wits and their physical capabilities, where technology couldn't help them, where they were completely dependent on either escaping or on convincing the Blackburn brothers to let them go. The drunk driving crisis of 1984. Drunk driving in 1984 was far more common and far more socially acceptable than it would become in later decades. Legal blood alcohol limits were higher. Many states allowed 0.15% BAC, nearly twice the modern 0.08% limit, before considering someone legally drunk. Enforcement was minimal. Police rarely set up DUI checkpoints. Drunk drivers were often allowed to sleep it off rather than being arrested. And the cultural attitude was that drunk driving was a personal choice rather than a serious crime. Social acceptance meant that driving drunk after hunting trips, after nights at bars, after family gatherings where alcohol was served, was considered normal behavior, was something people did routinely without expecting to face consequences. Accident rates were far higher. In 1984, over 24,000 people died in drunk driving accidents in the United States annually, compared to approximately 13,000 by 2020, reflecting both higher rates of drunk driving and less effective safety measures. The Blackburn brothers driving drunk with loaded shotguns in their truck was behavior that would have been common in 1984 rural Kentucky, was something that happened every hunting season, and usually didn't result in tragedy only because most drunk hunters made it home without encountering anyone they wanted to hurt. The geographic isolation, Leslie County, Kentucky, in 1984 was extraordinarily isolated. Population of approximately 13,000 people spread across 404 square miles of mountainous terrain, meaning population density was about 32 people per square mile, compared to modern suburban areas that might have 5,000 or more people per square mile. No major highways ran through the county. Roads like Route 11 were two-lane mountain roads that wound through valleys and over ridges, that had minimal traffic, that could go miles without passing a residence or business. Hollows and side roads extended into even more remote areas where people lived who wanted to be far from neighbors or authorities, where roads were barely maintained, where you could disappear completely and not be found for days or weeks. Economic depression meant many properties were abandoned, empty houses, closed mines, unused logging roads, creating vast areas where someone could take captives without worrying about being seen or heard. For the Peterson family, this isolation meant that once they were forced to follow the Blackburn brothers off Route 11 onto side roads, they were entering territory where no one would witness what happened, where screaming wouldn't bring help, where they were completely at the mercy of two drunk men with a shotgun. The communication barrier. Even if the Peterson family had somehow escaped, or if James had managed to overpower the Blackburn brothers, getting help would have been extraordinarily difficult. Payphones were the only option for emergency calls, but they were located only in towns or at occasional rest stops, nothing in the deep hollows where the Blackburn brothers might take them. Flagging down other vehicles would only work if other vehicles appeared, and on isolated mountain roads in October 1984, you might drive for 30 minutes without seeing another car. Walking to find help would require knowing where you were, difficult in unfamiliar mountain territory, hiking miles through rough terrain, and hoping you walked toward help rather than deeper into wilderness. The lack of communication options meant that once the Peterson family was taken into the mountains, they were effectively isolated from the outside world, were in a situation where their survival depended entirely on what happened between them and the Blackburn brothers with no possibility of outside intervention. The setting? Leslie County, Kentucky, October 1984. To understand the horror of what happened to the Peterson family, one must understand the place and time. Leslie County, Kentucky, in October 1984, a region where poverty, isolation, and the cultural remnants of Appalachian frontier justice created an environment where violence could erupt suddenly and where dangerous men could operate with relative impunity. The region Leslie County in southeastern Kentucky was coal country. The economy had been dominated by coal mining for generations. And by 1984, the industry was in decline, leaving behind environmental devastation, economic hardship, and a population that was aging and shrinking as young people left for opportunities elsewhere. The county seat, Hyden, had a population of maybe 500 people in 1984. The entire county had no traffic lights, had one small hospital, had law enforcement consisting of a sheriff and maybe a dozen deputies who had to cover over 400 square miles of difficult terrain. State police presence was minimal. One or two troopers might patrol the entire county, responding to calls but unable to provide the kind of routine patrol coverage that would exist in more populated areas. The population that remained was primarily working class and poor: coal miners, loggers, subsistence farmers, people who worked in the few remaining small businesses, people who lived on disability payments or on black lung benefits from decades in the mines. Many families had been in the region for generations, had kinship networks that extended throughout the county, and had cultural traditions that valued independence, family loyalty, and the right to handle disputes without involving authorities. The Blackburn brothers. Fictional backstory. Vernon and Curtis Blackburn were fictional products of this environment. Vernon Blackburn, age 44 in October 1984, was the older brother. He'd dropped out of school in 8th grade, not unusual in an era when dropping out to work was common and often necessary for family survival. Had worked sporadically in coal mines, and as a logger, had never held a job for more than a year or two because his violent temper and his drinking made him unemployable. He'd served time in state prison in the 1960s for aggravated assault, had beaten a man with a tire iron after a dispute at a bar, and had been released in 1971. Since then, he'd been arrested multiple times for assault, for drunk and disorderly conduct, for domestic violence against his wife, who'd eventually left him and moved to Ohio with their 2 children. By 1984, Vernon was living in a rundown trailer on family property outside Hyden, was surviving on odd jobs and on money from disability claim for a back injury that may or may not have been genuine, and was drinking heavily every day, cheap bourbon primarily, whatever he could afford, enough to stay constantly intoxicated but functional enough to drive and to hunt and to survive. Curtis Blackburn, age 37, was following his older brother's path. Curtis had dropped out of school even earlier than Vernon, had worked in mines until an injury, a collapsed tunnel that killed 2 men and injured Curtis's leg, had left him with a permanent limp and with a settlement that he'd blown through in less than a year on drinking and gambling. Curtis had his own criminal record: assault charges, DUI arrests, one weapons charge for shooting at a neighbor's dog that had wandered onto Blackburn property. He lived with Vernon in the trailer, the 2 brothers surviving together on their combined disability payments and odd jobs, drinking together, hunting together, reinforcing each other's worst tendencies. Both brothers were known throughout Leslie County as dangerous men. People locals knew to avoid, knew not to provoke, knew were likely to respond to any perceived disrespect with violence. The Blackburn reputation was such that store owners would serve them quickly and without argument, that bar owners would refuse to serve them because the trouble they caused wasn't worth the money they spent, that neighbors would tolerate their noise and their occasional trespassing because complaining might result in violence. The hunting culture. October 1984 was deer season in Kentucky, and hunting was central to Appalachian culture, not just as sport, but as way to supplement family food supplies, as tradition passed from fathers to sons, as social activity where men would bond, and where status within communities was determined partly by hunting skill. The Blackburn brothers had been hunting that Friday, October 12th, had started early in the morning and had spent most of the day in the woods. They'd shot a deer around noon, a young buck that they'd field-dressed and loaded into the back of Vernon's Dodge Ram, and then they'd started drinking to celebrate the successful hunt. By 3 p.m., both brothers were significantly intoxicated. By 6 p.m., when they encountered the Peterson family on Route 11, they'd been drinking for 3 hours straight, had consumed most of a bottle of Old Crow bourbon between them, and were in the mean, aggressive state that characterized their drunkenness. The shotgun that Curtis carried, an old Stevens 311's 12-gauge double barrel, was a common hunting weapon, had been in the Blackburn family for decades, was a reliable if crude firearm that could kill deer at 40 yards, and could kill humans at much greater distances. The gun was loaded with .0 buckshot, 9.33 caliber lead pellets per shell, designed to bring down large game, capable of inflicting devastating injuries on humans. The culture of violence. The willingness of the Blackburn brothers to escalate a minor traffic dispute into violence wasn't aberrant in their cultural context. It reflected patterns that existed in parts of rural Appalachia where honor was valued above almost everything else, where perceived disrespect demanded response, where family loyalty meant brothers would support each other in violence regardless of whether that violence was justified. This wasn't true of all or even most Appalachian residents. The region's culture also valued hospitality, community, hard work, and most residents were peaceful people who'd never consider responding to a honked horn with murder. But there was a subset of the population, particularly among families with histories of violence and with heavy drinking problems, where violence was normalized response to conflict, where backing down was viewed as weakness that invited further disrespect, and where drunk men with guns were a dangerous combination that everyone local knew to avoid. The Blackburn brothers represented this subset, men who'd learned from childhood that violence was an acceptable way to handle problems, who'd been reinforced in this belief by family members and peers who celebrated toughness and condemned weakness, who'd never faced sufficient consequences for their violence to make them reconsider their behavior, and who when drunk became even more dangerous because alcohol removed whatever minimal inhibitions they might have, sober. The chase, 30 miles of terror. For approximately 40 minutes, from 6:35 p.m. until approximately 7:15 p.m., the Peterson family was forced to follow the Blackburn brothers' Dodge Ram through increasingly isolated sections of Leslie County. The first 10 miles, Route 11. Initially, James Peterson hoped that staying on Route 11 meant they'd eventually encounter other vehicles, might see a state police car, might have opportunity to attract attention, or to somehow signal for help. But the Blackburn brothers were driving slowly, approximately 25 miles per hour, well below the 55-mile speed limit, and were weaving across the center line in ways that made it dangerous for anyone to pass, even if James had been willing to risk trying. Inside the Peterson truck, the family was experiencing escalating terror. Carol was trying to keep Amy calm, holding the 6-year-old close, telling her stories to distract her, trying to prevent her youngest child from understanding how much danger they were in. Walter was watching the road, looking for any opportunities, intersections where they might turn off, places where other vehicles might appear, anything that might provide a chance to escape or to get help. Rebecca and Michael in the extended cab were holding hands, the 16-year-old trying to comfort her 13-year-old brother, even though she was terrified herself. Both teenagers understanding enough to know this wasn't just a strange encounter that would end safely. James was making constant calculations, whether he should try to ram the Blackburn truck and push past them, whether he should suddenly stop and reverse at high speed, whether he should take any of the side roads they passed and try to outrun the Blackburn brothers in the unfamiliar territory. Every option seemed to have more potential for disaster than for success, and every passing minute took them further from help and deeper into isolation. Around 6:50 p.m., another vehicle appeared on Route 11, a pickup truck coming from the opposite direction, driven by what looked like a local farmer, James flashed his lights rapidly, desperate to signal distress, but Curtis Blackburn turned around in the Dodge Ram and pointed the shotgun directly at the Peterson truck's windshield, making clear that any further attempts to signal would result in shooting. The other vehicle passed without the driver noticing. Anything unusual about two trucks traveling together on Route 11, without understanding that a family was being kidnapped in plain sight, without realizing that help was needed desperately. The turn on to County Road, at approximately 7 p.m., near the community of Cutchin, which consisted of maybe 24 houses scattered across several miles, the Blackburn brothers turned off Road 11 onto County Road 2018, a narrower paved road that led into more isolated territory. James briefly considered not making the turn, considered staying on Route 11 and hoping the Blackburn brothers wouldn't actually shoot. But Vernon anticipated this. He stopped his truck at the intersection, got out with his own weapon, a pump-action shotgun that had been lying on the Dodge's bench seat, and stood in the middle of the road, making clear that if James didn't turn, Vernon would start shooting. James turned onto County Road 2018, followed the Blackburn brothers deeper into territory that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar, increasingly isolated, increasingly hopeless. The paved county road lasted for perhaps 3 miles, passing a few scattered houses, but none close enough to the road that screaming would be heard, none with people visible outside. Passing closed churches and abandoned buildings, climbing into higher elevations where the fog was thicker and where the darkness was more complete as the last light faded from the October sky. The final turn, into the hollow. At approximately 7:10 p.m., the Blackburn brothers turned off County Road 2018 onto an unmarked gravel road, what locals would call a holler road, unpaved, barely maintained, leading to the most isolated areas where people lived, who wanted to be far from anyone or anything. This turn marked the point where escape became nearly impossible. The gravel road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, with forest thick on both sides, with no room to maneuver or turn around, with no possibility of encountering other vehicles, because roads like this served perhaps 1 or 2 properties and weren't through roads to anywhere. "James, we have to try something," Walter said quietly from the passenger side, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "Once they get us wherever they're taking us, we won't have any options. We have to try now while we're still in the trucks." James looked at his father, at the old man who'd survived the Depression and World War II, who'd worked in coal mines for 40 years, who'd raised 6 children, and who was now facing the possibility of watching his grandchildren be hurt or killed. "What do you suggest?" James asked, genuinely wanting advice because his own mind was paralyzed by fear and by the impossibility of the situation. "Ram them," Walter said. "Speed up, hit their truck from behind, try to disable it or push it off the road. It's dangerous, might hurt us, but staying with them is going to get us all killed." "But the gun?" James started. "They'll shoot if we do nothing too," Walter said. "At least if we fight, we might have a chance." James looked at Carol, at Amy between them, at Rebecca and Michael, visible in the rearview mirror. His family was looking to him to make a decision, to do something that would save them, to be the father and husband who protected them, even when protection seemed impossible. He made his decision. He accelerated, pushed the F-250's engine to speed up on the narrow gravel road, closed the distance to the Blackburn truck ahead, preparing to ram them and to accept whatever consequences came from fighting back. But Vernon Blackburn had been watching his mirrors, had seen the Peterson truck accelerating, understood immediately what was about to happen. He slammed on his brakes hard enough that the Dodge's rear tires locked up, hard enough that the truck slid on the gravel, hard enough that when James hit the brakes to avoid collision, the F-250 couldn't stop in time on the loose gravel surface. The Peterson truck hit the Blackburn truck, not hard, maybe 10-15 meters impact, enough to jolt everyone in both vehicles, but not enough to cause serious damage or injuries, not enough to disable either truck or to achieve what James had hoped. Vernon's truck slid forward maybe 10 feet from the impact, then stopped. For several seconds, both trucks sat motionless on the narrow gravel road, engines running, dust settling. Then both doors of the Blackburn truck opened, and Vernon and Curtis got out, both brothers carrying their shotguns, both clearly enraged by what had just happened. The attack forced off the road. What happened next occurred quickly, perhaps 3 or 4 minutes from when the Blackburn brothers got out of their truck until the Peterson truck went off the road. But for the people experiencing it, those minutes contained lifetimes of terror. The confrontation. Vernon stormed back to the Peterson truck, his face red with drunken rage, his shotgun pointed directly at James through the windshield. "You tried to hit us!" he screamed, his words slurred but his fury evident. You tried to fucking hit us." "I'm sorry," James shouted back through the closed window, his hands raised to show he wasn't threatening. "The brakes didn't work on the gravel. I couldn't stop. It was an accident." "Bullshit!" Vernon screamed. "You tried to ram us, tried to push us off the road. Curtis, shoot out their tires." Curtis moved to the side of the Peterson truck, raised his double-barrel shotgun, and fired both barrels in rapid succession. Boom, boom, the sound deafening in the quiet hollow, the zero-roll buckshot shredding the front passenger side tire and part of the rear tire on the same side. Amy screamed. Carol screamed. Rebecca and Michael were crying in the extended cab, terrified by the gunfire, and by understanding that the drunk men were shooting at their truck were escalating from threats to actual violence. The F-250 listed to the right as the tires, deflated, but it was still mobile, could still drive on the rims if necessary. "Get out," Vernon ordered, pointing his shotgun at James. "Everyone out of the truck, now." "Please don't hurt my children," James said, and his voice broke. And the plea was the sound of a man who understood he was powerless, but who was begging anyway because there was nothing else he could do. "Please, they're just children. They haven't done anything wrong." Vernon fired his shotgun into the air, a warning shot that made everyone in the Peterson truck scream again, that showered them with debris from tree branches the shot had hit, that made clear Vernon was willing to shoot and that the next shot might not be a warning. "I said get out," Vernon screamed. James looked at his family one more time, made a decision that he'd spend the rest of his life wondering about. "Stay in the truck," he told them. "Lock the doors when I get out. Don't open them for anyone. If you get a chance to drive away, drive. Don't worry about me, just drive and get help." "James, no," Carol started. "Do it," James said, and he opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel road, positioning himself between Vernon's gun and the truck containing his family. Curtis had reloaded his double-barrel shotgun, had broken it open and inserted 2 fresh shells, had closed it with a snap that communicated readiness to shoot again. "Smart man," Vernon said, swaying slightly from the alcohol and from the adrenaline. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You disrespected us. You honked at us. You tried to hit us. So, we're going to teach you a lesson." "I've learned it," James said desperately. "I understand. I won't ever honk at anyone again. I'll never honk at another driver for the rest of my life. Just please let my family go." "Too late for that," Vernon said, and he gestured with his shotgun toward the edge of the road, where the ground dropped away steeply, a hillside covered with trees and brush, falling away maybe 50 feet down to a rocky creek bed below. "Push the truck off," Vernon ordered Curtis. "No!" James lunged toward his truck, trying to reach it, trying to stop what was about to happen. Vernon swung his shotgun, hit James in the head with the wooden stock, a blow hard enough to drop James to the ground, stunned and bleeding from a cut on his scalp. Curtis moved to the driver's door of the Peterson truck, tried the handle, found it locked like James had ordered. "They locked it," Curtis called to Vernon. "Break the window," Vernon said. Curtis used the butt of his shotgun to smash the driver's side window, reached through to unlock the door, opened it. Walter tried to grab Curtis's arm, tried to prevent him from getting into the truck, but at 71 years old, Walter couldn't overcome the younger drunk man, who pushed him back roughly. Curtis climbed into the driver's seat, put the truck in neutral. "Help me push," he called to Vernon. Vernon moved to help, and together the two brothers began, pushing the Peterson truck toward the edge of the road. The truck, heavy and listing on its blown tires, resisted at first, but the slight downward slope and the brothers' combined strength gradually got it moving. Inside the truck, Carol was screaming. Walter was trying to climb into the driver's seat to put the truck back in park. Rebecca was holding Michael and Amy, who were all crying and terrified. James, bleeding and disoriented from being hit in the head, struggled to his feet, stumbled toward his truck, was 10 feet away when the front wheels went over the edge. The Peterson truck tilted forward, its weight shifting toward the steep hillside. For a moment it balanced on the edge, and then gravity took over. The truck rolled forward, crashed through the brush, hit a tree that spun it sideways, flipped over onto its side, and tumbled down the hillside in a horrible symphony of crushing metal and breaking glass and screaming voices that got fainter as the truck rolled further down toward the creek bed below. The truck came to rest approximately 50 feet below the road, lying on its passenger side, front end facing downhill, steam rising from the ruptured radiator, one headlight still illuminating the trees and rocks. For several seconds there was silence except for the hissing of the damaged engine. Then the screaming started. Not adult screaming, but children screaming, high-pitched and terrified. The sounds of Rebecca and Michael and Amy crying for their parents, asking what happened, begging for help. James ran to the edge of the road, started climbing down the steep hillside, slipping on loose soil and rocks, falling and scraping his hands and knees. not caring about his own injuries, thinking only about reaching his family. Vernon Blackburn raised his shotgun, pointed it down at James. "Stop right there." James froze, 15 feet down the hillside, looking up at Vernon, who stood at the edge of the road, pointing a gun down at him. "Please," James said, and the word came out broken and desperate. "Please don't hurt my family. You've made your point. We're hurt. We're trapped. We understand you're serious. Just let us live. Please, just let us live." Vernon looked down at James for a long moment, his drunk brain processing what had just happened, what he was being asked to do. For a second, James thought maybe Vernon would agree, would let them live, would call this even, and walk away. But then Curtis appeared at the edge of the road, still carrying his double-barrel shotgun, and said, "We can't let them go, Vernon. They've seen our faces. They'll tell the police what we done." Vernon nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his alcohol-fogged mind. Yeah, you're right." "No," James screamed. "We won't tell anyone. We'll say it was an accident, that the truck went off the road by itself. No one has to know you were involved." "Can't risk it," Vernon said, and he started climbing down the hillside toward the overturned Peterson truck, toward the family trapped inside. The Massacre, 6 murders in a hollow. Author's note: the following section contains graphic fictional violence, including violence against children. This is a fictional narrative created for storytelling purposes, but the content is extremely disturbing. Readers should be aware this section depicts the murder of fictional children and may be too distressing for some readers. What happened in that hollow over the next 15 minutes represents the absolute worst of human nature. Drunk men murdering a defenseless family, including 3 children, killing methodically with an old shotgun, eliminating everyone who could testify about what had happened. Vernon and Curtis Blackburn descended the hillside, carrying their shotguns, approaching the overturned Peterson truck where the family was trapped inside. James tried to reach the truck first, tried to position himself between the Blackburn brothers and his family, but Vernon simply shot him, fired the pump-action shotgun from approximately 20 feet away, the buckshot pattern spreading enough at that distance that multiple pellets hit James in the chest and abdomen, dropping him immediately, leaving him bleeding and dying on the hillside while his family screamed from inside the truck. The Blackburn brothers continued down to the overturned truck. The passenger side was now facing up, since the truck had landed on its side. Vernon and Curtis could hear the family inside, Walter calling for James, Carol crying, the 3 children sobbing and terrified. Vernon used the butt of his shotgun to break out the remaining glass from the passenger window that was now accessible on top of the overturned truck. He looked down into the truck interior where the family was trapped. Carol and Amy had been thrown around during the rollover. Walter was injured with what looked like a broken arm. Rebecca and Michael had been partially thrown from the extended cab and were tangled in the seats. What followed was systematic murder. The Blackburn brothers shooting into the overturned truck, reloading their shotguns, shooting again, methodically killing each member of the Peterson family, because they'd been drunk and violent and had escalated a minor traffic dispute into mass murder, and now felt they had no choice but to eliminate all witnesses. The details of these murders are too graphic and too disturbing to describe with specificity. Sufficient to say that by approximately 7:25 p.m., less than an hour after the initial confrontation on Route 11, all 6 members of the Peterson family were dead. James Peterson, 42, shot on the hillside while trying to protect his family. Carol Peterson, 40, shot while trapped in the overturned truck. Rebecca Peterson, 16, Michael Peterson, 13, and Amy Peterson, 6, murdered while trapped and helpless. Walter Peterson, 71, killed while trying to shield his grandchildren with his own body. 6 people who'd been alive and looking forward to getting home. An hour earlier, were dead in a hollow in Leslie County, Kentucky, murdered by 2 drunk brothers with an old shotgun because a father had dared to honk his horn at men who viewed any perceived disrespect as justification for murder. The cover-up, drunk men's incompetence. After the murders, the Blackburn brothers attempted to cover up what they'd done, but their drunkenness and their limited intelligence meant their cover-up efforts were incompetent and would ultimately make it easier for investigators to solve the crime. First, they searched the bodies for identification and valuables, took wallets and purses, took Carol's jewelry, planning to dispose of these items far from the crime scene. Second, they attempted to make the scene look like a traffic accident, tried to position the bodies to look like they died in the crash rather than from gunshot wounds, tried to wipe their fingerprints from surfaces they'd touched. But they were too drunk to do this effectively, left shell casings from their shotguns scattered around the scene, left obvious footprints in the soft soil around the truck, left evidence everywhere that this was a crime scene rather than an accident. Third, they climbed back up to the road, got in Vernon's Dodge Ram, which still had blood splatter on it from the deer they'd killed earlier that day, and drove away, heading back toward their trailer, planning to hide the stolen items and to establish alibis. What the Blackburn brothers didn't consider, what their drunk brains couldn't process, was that multiple people had seen them earlier that day, that the deer in the back of their truck would help establish timeline, that their guns could be matched to the buckshot recovered from victims, and that their reputations as violent drunks would immediately make them suspects once the bodies were discovered. The discovery, finding the victims. The Peterson family's disappearance was noticed quickly because they'd told Carol's sister Ruth, who lived in Hazard, that they'd be home by 8 p.m., and when they didn't arrive and didn't call, Ruth became worried. The initial response, October 12th, 8:30 p.m., 11 p.m. Ruth called the Kentucky State Police at 8:45 p.m. to report that her sister's family hadn't arrived home when expected, that they'd been traveling on Route 11 through Leslie County, and that she was concerned something might have happened. The dispatcher took the information but didn't immediately treat it as an emergency. Families were often late, cars broke down, people stopped for dinner without calling. A bulletin was issued to troopers in the area to watch for the Peterson truck, but no intensive search was initiated. By 11 p.m., when the Petersons still hadn't arrived or called, and when Ruth drove part of the route they would have taken and didn't find them, the state police upgraded the situation to a missing persons case and began actively searching. The search, October 13th, 6 a.m., 2 p.m. At first light on Saturday, October 13th, state police and local volunteers began searching Route 11 and connecting roads for any sign of the Peterson truck. They drove slowly, checking every pull-off and side road, looking for skid marks or other evidence of an accident. At approximately 2:15 p.m., a searcher found tire tracks and broken brush at the edge of the gravel road where the Peterson truck had gone off. Following the tracks down the hillside, they discovered the overturned truck and, shortly thereafter, the bodies of all 6 family members. The crime scene, October 13th, 2:30 p.m., October 14th, 6 a.m. The crime scene investigation immediately revealed this was murder rather than an accident. Shell casings from 12-gauge shotguns were found scattered around the scene, multiple casings indicating many shots had been fired. Shotgun pellets were recovered from victims' bodies, and the wound patterns were inconsistent with accident injuries. Tire tracks at the top of the hill showed where another vehicle had pushed the Peterson truck off the road. Footprints in the soil showed where at least 2 people had descended the hillside after the truck went over. Witness statements from people who'd seen 2 trucks traveling together on Route 11 the previous evening provided descriptions of a rusty Dodge Ram pickup. By midnight on October 13th, investigators had identified Vernon and Curtis Blackburn as primary suspects based on the vehicle description matching Vernon's Dodge Ram, the Blackburn brothers' reputations for violence. Witness reports that the brothers had been drinking and hunting on October 12th. The fact that shotgun murders matched the brothers' known weapons. The arrest, drunk confessions. At 6:30 a.m. on October 14th, Kentucky State Police surrounded the Blackburn brothers' trailer and arrested both men without resistance. Both brothers were still drunk or hungover from the previous day's drinking, were confused about why they were being arrested, and were too impaired to effectively lie about their involvement. The interrogation. During separate interrogations on October 14th and 15th, both brothers confessed to the murders, though each tried to minimize his own role and blame the other. Vernon claimed that Curtis had fired most of the shots, that Vernon had only participated because Curtis had started the violence and Vernon had felt obligated to support his brother, that the murders had been Curtis's idea. Curtis claimed that Vernon had been the primary shooter, that Curtis had only followed Vernon's orders, that everything had been Vernon's decision and Curtis had just gone along to avoid Vernon's anger. The confessions were recorded on cassette tape, standard technology in 1984, and provided detailed descriptions of the murders that matched the physical evidence from the crime scene. The physical evidence. The Blackburn brothers' trailer was searched, and investigators found the shotguns used in the murders, still loaded with .00 buckshot matching what was recovered from victims, stolen items from the Peterson truck, including wallets and Carol's jewelry, bloody clothing that matched blood types of the victims, the deer carcass in Vernon's truck that helped establish timeline. The physical evidence, combined with confessions and witness statements, provided overwhelming proof of guilt. The trial, justice in 1985. The Blackburn brothers were tried separately for 6 counts of capital murder in Kentucky State Court in 1985. Vernon Blackburn's trial took place in March 1985 in a different county. The trial was moved because the crime had generated too much local publicity for fair jury selection in Leslie County. The prosecution presented the confessions, the physical evidence, the witness testimony, and expert analysis showing that the murders had been deliberate and premeditated rather than being accidents or crimes of passion. Vernon's defense argued that he'd been too drunk to form intent to commit murder, that the deaths were the result of an altercation that had gone wrong rather than being planned murders. But the prosecution countered that Vernon had been sober enough to drive, to hunt earlier in the day, to carefully plan covering up the crime afterward, and that drunkenness didn't eliminate criminal responsibility for deliberate killings. The jury convicted Vernon Blackburn on all 6 counts of capital murder after only 3 hours of deliberation. He was sentenced to death by electric chair, Kentucky's method of execution, in 1985. Curtis Blackburn's trial took place in June 1985 with similar evidence and similar results. Curtis was also convicted on all 6 counts and sentenced to death. The appeals? Both brothers appealed their convictions and death sentences through the 1980s and 1990s. Vernon's appeals focused on arguments that he'd been too drunk to form intent, that his confession had been coerced, that he'd had ineffective legal representation. All appeals were denied. Curtis's appeals made similar arguments with similar lack of success. The execution's Vernon Blackburn was executed by electric chair in Kentucky State Penitentiary on November 17, 1999, at age 59. Having spent 14 years on death row. His last words were reportedly, "I'm sorry for what happened. I was drunk and stupid. Tell the Peterson family I'm sorry." Curtis Blackburn was executed on March 3, 2001, at age 54, having spent 16 years on death row. His last words were, "May God forgive me." Both brothers died for their decision to murder 6 people over a honked horn, for escalating a minor traffic dispute into a massacre because they were drunk and violent and armed and couldn't tolerate what they perceived as disrespect. Resolution: the meaning of drunk violence. The fictional murders of the Peterson family by the Blackburn brothers represent the kind of senseless alcohol-fueled violence that was far more common in 1984 than it would become in later decades after society began taking drunk driving and alcohol-related violence more seriously. The drunk driving context. In 1984, approximately 24,000 Americans died in drunk driving accidents annually. The Blackburn brothers' willingness to drive drunk with loaded weapons was behavior that thousands of people engaged in every day, usually without consequences, but occasionally with tragic results. The Peterson family's encounter with the Blackburn brothers was extraordinarily unlucky. Most people who encountered drunk drivers managed to avoid confrontation. Most drunk drivers made it home without killing anyone. Most traffic disputes didn't escalate to violence. But when all the wrong factors aligned, drunk men with violent histories, with weapons, with willingness to escalate conflict, encountering a family at the wrong time in an isolated location, tragedy could result. The cultural context. The Blackburn brothers' response to being honked at, interpreting it as disrespect requiring violent response, reflected cultural patterns in parts of rural America, where honor was valued intensely, where perceived insults demanded immediate response, where backing down was viewed as weakness. This honor culture wasn't universal in Appalachia or in rural America generally, but it existed in pockets, particularly among families with histories of violence and among men whose economic and social circumstances left them with little to be proud of except their reputations for toughness. The weapon access. The fact that the Blackburn brothers were driving around drunk with loaded shotguns was completely legal in 1984. Kentucky. There were no laws against having firearms in vehicles, no requirements for weapons to be unloaded or secured, no restrictions on drunk people possessing weapons. This unrestricted access to firearms, combined with alcohol and violent temperaments, created the conditions where traffic disputes could escalate instantly to lethal violence, where arguments that should have ended with angry words instead ended with 6 people dead. The lesson about de-escalation. James Peterson did everything reasonable people would advise, tried to de-escalate, apologized, offered to do whatever the Blackburn brothers wanted, begged for his family's safety. But he was dealing with drunk men who'd been conditioned by their life experiences to view any perceived disrespect as intolerable, who had weapons and were willing to use them, who escalated the situation until murder seemed like their only option to avoid being arrested. The lesson isn't that James did anything wrong. The lesson is that sometimes you encounter people so dangerous and so irrational that no response will prevent violence, that being right or being polite doesn't protect you, that sometimes evil erupts and destroys innocent lives regardless of what those innocent people do or don't do. The memory of fictional victims. Though this narrative is entirely fictional, the Peterson family, James, Carol, Rebecca, Michael, Amy, and Walter, represent real victims of drunk driving violence and alcohol-fueled murder who've existed throughout American history. Real families who've been destroyed by people whose drinking removed whatever inhibitions might have prevented them from committing atrocities. If this fictional narrative serves any purpose, it's to remind us that drunk driving isn't just a traffic safety issue. It's a violence issue, that drunk people with weapons are extraordinarily dangerous, and that the campaign against drunk driving that intensified in the late 1980s and 1990s, through organizations like EMAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, saved countless lives by making drunk driving socially unacceptable and by creating legal consequences, severe enough to deter at least some people from driving while intoxicated. The 1984 setting of this fictional story represents an era when drunk driving was tolerated in ways that later generations would find incomprehensible, when men like the Blackburn brothers could drive around drunk with loaded weapons and face minimal consequences unless they actually killed someone, and when isolation in rural areas meant that help was too far away to prevent tragedies that might have been prevented in more populated areas with better emergency response infrastructure.